What's the current state of employment in Mecklenburg County? And so since the pandemic started, we've really been tracking the changes in the labor force and the changes in overall employment locally. And recently we've noted that we are back to pre-pandemic levels of labor force in Mecklenburg County and pre-pandemic levels of employment in Mecklenburg County. And you can see again between January of 2020 and the most recent data in November of 2021, there was almost exactly at pre-pandemic levels, 0.1% higher than they were pre-pandemic. And so given that, what we wanted to do today was really zoom into what does that look like at a sector level, because we're still hearing a lot about employers, struggling with a great resignation, this great realignment, employers struggling to hire. And at the same time, we're seeing labor force and employment levels back at pre-pandemic levels. So how do we reconcile those two contradictory points? And what we really saw when you zoom into the data is that not all sectors have seen equal recovery. And so there are a number of sectors that have actually seen strong growth in employment since the start of the pandemic. And so the top three sectors here locally in Mecklenburg County for employment growth since 2020, we've got trade, transportation, and utilities. We've got professional and business services, and the finance sector. And if you look at that overall levels of employment, you can see those top two added over 40,000 jobs over the past year, and finance has still added over 8,000 jobs. And on the right-hand side, you can see that relative change. So again, everyone's roughly around 5% increase, just a little bit over that since 2020. So you're seeing some strong growth in these three sectors since the start of the pandemic. And then we want to go ahead and contrast that with what are those sectors that have seen the biggest contraction since the start of the pandemic? And so this list is going to look relatively familiar to you in terms of what we've been tracking over those industries hardest hit by the pandemic: accommodation and food services, manufacturing and goods production, and leisure and hospitality. And if you look at, again, all of these industries, the accommodation and food service, just under 20,000 jobs lost. Manufacturing and leisure and hospitality, just under 15,000 jobs lost each. And then if you look over on the right-hand side, again, leisure and hospitality is at the bottom in terms of total jobs lost across all these sectors, but in terms of relative change, they're the highest, as that 14,000 represents 10% of the overall employment in that sector. So again, disproportionately hit. You see accommodation and food right behind that at 9%. So again, these industries, outsized impact in terms of the impact of the pandemic on their employment numbers. And so that's why you're still continuing to hear issues around employers struggling to hire, this talent shortage, this great realignment. You're hearing a lot of that come from these industries particularly. And so obviously now the next question you might have is, what does this mean long term? Are these pandemic trends here to stay, or is this just a short-term blip? And so the BLS recently released some data to this effect to zoom in to say, what are the 10-year projections based on occupation? And so one of the ones that I want to point out just to start is up at the top, you're going to see food preparation and serving related occupations. And you can see that's a third one down from the top. That blue bar indicates expected recovery from COVID-19. So this is still a profession that's expected to grow over the next 10 years, but you can see almost all of that growth is coming from pandemic recovery. So fortunately, according to the BLS, this is one occupation that we expect to see the recovery of this occupation over the next 10 years. So hopefully this isn't something that is a long-term trend of decrease for this industry in particular. And if you go down a little bit further towards the bottom, on the flip side there, you'll see 3 up from the bottom. Production is expected to actually decline over the next 10 years. So manufacturing and production, we looked at that. You see here, the manufacturing goods production, that's down over almost 15,000. That is expected to potentially continue to decline over the next 10 years. And then one other thing that BLS also recently released is, again, there's a lot of talk around the graying of the labor force. We noticed a lot of early retirements driven by the pandemic, and so this shrinking labor force. So people are concerned about what is the state of the labor force participation rate hold going forward. And so one thing that is encouraging is the BLS's projection shows that the growth rates for the labor force over the next 10 years is expected to be slightly higher than it was between 2010 and 2020. And that is despite, again, the population growth rate continuing to shrink. So we again might see some of that labor force growth as people are returning to the labor force after exiting due to the pandemic. And so again, that's all I've got for you today, but I hope you enjoyed the quick update on the state of employment in Mecklenburg County.